You're listening to Sports Connections with David Smale, the show that brings you a fun and intimate look into connections throughout sports. Now here's your host, David Smale.
Jan Stenerud was born in Fetsund, Norway. He was an outstanding ski jumper and attended Montana State on a skiing scholarship. And Jan ended up playing 2 seasons of varsity football for the Bobcats. He connected on a then record 59-yard field goal, and he scored 82 points. The Kansas City Chiefs were so impressed that they drafted him in the 3rd round of the 1966 draft. His 373 career field goals and 7 seasons of scoring 100 or more points were NFL records. He kicked 17 field goals longer than 50 yards. His personal best was a 55-yarder against Denver in 1970. In an era when average kickers made about 60% of their kicks, he was the first kicker to make at least 80% of his field goals. And he did that when he actually made 91.7% in 1981. He was the first pure kicker to be inducted into the Pro Football Hall of Fame. Jan, welcome to Sports Connections.
Boy, Dave, you've done a lot of homework. Most of it, all of it is true, actually. So,
well, just talk about your journey from Norway to Montana State to the NFL.
Well, when I grew up in Norway, I was born there during the war, 1942. And as I grew up, when I was 8 years old, I remember competing in my first ski jumping event. We had almost every kid in the neighborhood has either cross-country skiers or jumpers. And I remember my first meet, I was actually 8 years old. The class was 7 and 8 year olds. And I finished second. And I still remember the name of the guy that beat me that day. But anyway, my dad was an avid ski jumper. Actually, I had an uncle that was an alternate for the 1928 Olympics. That goes back a little ways. And so ski jumping was important. We had 28 jumping hills, actually, in my little hometown.
Oh, wow.
And 4 or 5 of them had lights on. You could just switch the light. After dinner, we'd go down, we'd turn the light on, and the whole jumping hill was lit up so we could practice at night. But anyway, I continued, and by the time you get to be 16, 17, 18, there are not that many of us left because you kind of quit as you don't perform very well, I suppose. So in 1962, I finished in top 10, I think I was 6th, in the Norwegian Junior National Championship in ski jumping. And out of the blue, I get a letter from the ski coach and another Norwegian guy already on ski scholarship at Montana State and offered me a full ride scholarship. I had to handle my travel from Norway to Bozeman, Montana. But then it was a full ride ski scholarship. We had a meeting, my mother and dad and I. My father was all for it. My mother wasn't that excited about it. But we decided to at least try it for a year. Now, one reason that it was so tempting, I had an uncle and aunt that had immigrated to the United States in the early 20s. They settled in Buffalo, New York, and they came back about every 5th year. And they talk about America and the skyscrapers in New York, the big cars, all the stuff that I heard about America was so fantastic. And it was truly a land of opportunity, and that's how I felt about it. So I was really looking forward to accept the scholarship, and I flew from Norway to Idlewild Airport, which is now called Kennedy Airport in New York. Mm-hmm. Spent a couple of days there, stopped in Buffalo, New York, and took a train all the way out to Bozeman, Montana. And this was in late August, early September of 1962.
Okay, and then just tell the story. What were you doing? Just practicing placekicking? I mean, that doesn't sound like something a Norwegian would take to.
No, we didn't have. There was no soccer being played at Montana State in those days. But I played a lot of soccer as a youth. I was on the soccer team as well, as long as I can remember, when I grew up. But part of my workout for the ski season, because jumping was my sport, and the other one I had to do was cross-country skiing, which I didn't like. It was a pain for about an hour. It'd take about an hour to run 10 miles. That was a normal race, and it was also up in the Rockies where the altitude was pretty high. So part of my workout to get ready for the ski season, to get in good shape and get my legs strong, was to run the stadium steps at the football stadium at Montana State University. And so I did that as a freshman, sophomore. My junior year, one day, the kicker on the team, who also was a defensive back on the team, he was kicking field goals in the stadium. And I had met him a couple of times, so I went down and kicked a few with him. And I had tennis shoes on, kicked the toes like he did. I noticed that right away I kicked the ball further than he did. And after a few attempts, I still asked, can you kick with the side of your foot? Like you take a corner kick in soccer. This was in fall of 1964, my junior year. And he said, yes, you can kick that way because there's a guy with the Buffalo Bills. His name is Pete Gogolak.
Yeah.
He kicks with the side of his foot. So I did that a few times, and I kicked it even better, I guess. And I did that just for the fun of it, 3 or 4 times at least that fall. And unbeknownst to me, the basketball coach, his name was Roger Kraft. He was actually from K-State. His son Les Kraft played at K-State about 20 years ago. So he had watched me, and he walked across the field and took another look and ran over to the football coach. His name was Jim Sweeney, later coached at Fresno and won a lot of games.
Yeah.
He says, there's a Norwegian skier out there kicking footballs distances that I haven't seen before. You ought to take a look at him. Well, Sweeney didn't think much about the scouting report from the basketball coach. So he didn't do anything about it. But about a couple of weeks later, again, before the last home game in 1964, I was running the stadium steps and I heard his voice yelling at me, hey, skier, get down here on the field. Here you can kick. And that was Jim Sweeney. Light workout on the Friday afternoon. The guys were standing around. He wanted me to kick off a couple of times. I had never put a ball on the tee before. And he said, kick from the 40-yard line. That's where the kickoff is. And I had a slight wind behind me, I remember, not strong. But anyway, I took a running start from about 7-8 yards, a little nervous. The big football players were standing around. There was a break in the action, so they were enjoying it. And I topped it, and it went like a squib kick. It was not successful. And they laughed a little bit. But as the Sweeney says, try one more. And this time I hit it perfectly. It went high and far. As a matter of fact, it went through the goalpost into the seats.
Oh, wow.
And that is, the goalpost was in the back end, so that was 70 yards to the goalpost. And he got quiet, and he says, can you do that again? And he says, yeah, I think I can. So I kicked a few more. They all landed in the seats behind the goalpost. And they start clapping, the players did. And Sweeney put his arm around me and he said, hey, young man, what are you doing tomorrow? And I knew that he was talking about the game. And he wanted me to get ready for the pre-game meal. He also explained to me that I wasn't eligible, but he wanted me to go out for football the following spring. He says, I want you to get used to the pre-game warm-up in front of the fans. Well, a full house at Montana State was 8,000 people. I had ski jumped in 1962 in front of 80,500 or whatever in Oslo, Norway. So the crowd didn't bother me. But anyway, that's how I got started. Went out for spring practice, and they changed my scholarship from skiing to football my senior year in 1965, and I actually did both.
You did both? I was going to ask.
Yes,
that.
1965, yes.
Okay.
But I was a senior. I was done after the 65 winter. No, the fall came, of course, first in 1965, the following year. So I was on the football team with this football scholarship. But since I was in 2 different sports, it was ruled that I could be on the football team 1 more year. So after the ski season in 1965, then I went for the second season in football, and because he wanted me to be drafted by both leagues, because after the first year, I'd been the future draft choice of the Kansas City Chiefs. They basically said, congratulations, you had been picked in the 3rd round of the AFL redshirt draft. Congratulations, Jack Stedman, president, Kansas City Chiefs. And I didn't know exactly what that meant, but what happened was that the AFL had a special draft of people that were still eligible for 1 more year. So then the next year then, and of course, but the reason they found out, I kicked a 59-yard field goal against the arch rival, University of Montana. That turned out to be 5 yards longer than any kick in college ever, and 3 yards further than the pro record, which was 56 at the time. So Sweeney said, if you have another good season, you will have a chance to get drafted by the NFL. And that particular year, I kicked 82 points. We had a lot of extra points. We had a good team. And that was a record for points scored by a kicker in those days. So then the NFL had a special draft of the AFL future draft choices from the year before. It gets pretty complicated. Atlanta Falcons picked me first out of those 30 guys that had been drafted that way. And Atlanta was brand new. And the minute I met Bobby Beathard, who was a scout for us then, and Tommy O'Boyle was the head talent scout, and Hank Stram, and of course, Lamar Hunt, there was no doubt where I wanted to go. But I had to go to Atlanta too to see what they had to offer. And
how much did you know about pro football in general when you signed with the Chiefs?
Very little. We went to the games at Montana State because the student body, most of the students went to the football game. That was the thing to do every Saturday afternoon. And I thought it was a big deal. Crowds were going crazy, and the cheerleaders are doing cartwheels in front of the players running on the field, and the bands were playing, and it was really fun. It was a party kind of. What struck me right away was that they only played for 5 seconds. And then they would stand around for about 30 seconds again. Then they looked like they did the same thing on the next play. So I like basketball better when I compare the two sports. But once I started watching football a little bit on television, I remember the Packers they were on the television a lot with Ray Scott, of course. So I learned something about the Packers. And then as I got into football, and the coach had me go to the offensive meetings, then I realized how good these guys were and how tough they were, how strong they were, what skills they had in certain positions. So I did get fascinated by it. And he wanted me to be, I'd never had a guy on the team before that couldn't do anything but kick. So he made me try to catch the ball and warm up with the receiver just to do something. So I thought it was fun. And they kept telling me that they'd never seen a guy on television even kick the ball as far as I did those days. So they encouraged me very much. I started off with a bunch of great Bobcats, Montana State Bobcats, and a lot of us are still friends after 55 years or whatever.
Sure. Just talk about your 19-year career in the AFL and then NFL. What are some of the highlights?
Well, when I came to camp, and of course before my first rookie year, Hank, the workout of the place during the season was close to Swope Park. It was on it's called the East Traffic Way. You take 63rd Street and goes east. You find where there's a soccer complex there right now. And before training camp, Hank would come out. Of course, training camp was in Liberty, Missouri, William Jewell College. And Hank would come out 3 or 4 times and hold the ball for me. Also measure my kickoffs and hold the ball and find out. Of course, the hash marks were out pretty wide then to find out if I was better from the left hash mark or right hash mark, et cetera, et cetera. He wanted to learn some about the soccer style kicking. Now, keep in mind, when I started at Montana State, my first step was backwards on extra point. There was no ESPN or NFL Network. I had never watched a soccer style kicker on television. I never seen another one kick. And I didn't even my first year in the pros, I don't think. And it was another year I saw your premium, I saw the Goggle Axe eventually. So, but my steps, I pretty much worked them out by then. So it was by hit and miss, and the short kicks, I just kind of tapped and kicked them pretty easy. A little harder from 40 yards, a little harder from 50, etc. So it was totally, learn. But also, in those days, you had no mini camps, so there were 120 people in training camp.
Yeah.
And we had 6 exhibition games, and the Chiefs had lost the first Super Bowl, the World Championship of Pro Football, to the Packers. So my first exhibition game in Kansas City, we had played one in Houston the week before, but my first game was against the Chicago Bears. And Hank won it in the worst way. In 67, actually, was the first year, I believe, that we started playing, out of those 6 exhibition games, 3 or 4 was against the NFL teams.
Right.
We tried to beat those NFL teams really hard because AFL was not respected as much yet.
Sure.
And we scored 66 points against the Bears. George Halas was still the coach. And the stadium went crazy. And so I came to Kansas City at the right time. The stadium was full for every exhibition game, and we took it very seriously. Heck, we played on the road against the Rams, the fearsome foursome. They were better known than the quarterback on that team. And there were 80,000 people. And we get paid $50 for the whole week, including the game. That was in 1967. Anyway, they had 6 kickers in camp, and they finally got it down to 1 and made the team. And then after my rookie year, I had kicked the longest field goal in the AFL, most field goals. I had 7 kicks blocked, I remember.
Wow.
They go down and miss it. We kicked from 7 yards. And they were rushing us maybe harder than most because I could kick, longer or further than the other people in the league. So, but anyway, Hank, I was in the basic training. I wasn't an American citizen yet. But my visa, what I didn't know, had qualified me for the U.S. Army. And the Vietnam War heated up, so I was able to get into a National Guard unit in Bozeman before I came to Kansas City, transferred to a unit here. So after my rookie year, I had to go to Fort Polk, Louisiana for 5.5 months. And then the first newspaper I saw when I got back was a picture of the front page was that Robert Kennedy had been shot. at the Ambassador Hotel in LA. It got to the sports page. There was a picture of Hank Stram with Jim Schaaf. They were in England trying out professional soccer players and rugby players. And he brought 6 guys to camp against me in 1968 for my second season. So I learned early on that you never could take anything for granted.
Yeah.
So in fact, for the full 19 years, I felt like if you had 2 bad games in a row, you could be in the unemployment line. And that's really, so in addition to the pressure of the game and winning games or doing a good job, there was also a pressure of keeping your job.
Sure. Now, you've talked about some of the highlights. I'm guessing being selected to the Pro Football Hall of Fame ranks pretty high up there. What did that feel like when you found out you've been selected?
Of course, I spent 13 years in Kansas City, and I thought I was too old. And they were right. Nick Lowry competed against me and he was good. We were fairly equal in camp, I thought. Of course, I felt like I was a little bit better, but nevertheless, Marv Levy was the coach, and Nick is 15 years younger. So it made sense for him, but it upset me some because I was cut with no place to go, plus that he had changed my style of kicking. He wanted to kick off a lot higher. Hang time was a big thing with him. So all of a sudden, instead of my kickoffs going deep in the end zone, they were landing on the 5-yard line. So I think most of the coaches around the league thought I was done. But anyway, I was out most of that season in 1979, or in 80 actually. And then Bart Starr got in trouble with his kicker up in Green Bay, and he calls me personally. And he said, "Can you still kick?" And I said, "Yes, I can." And that's how I ended up in Green Bay, and still had a lot of competition every year. But anyway, I had 4 really good seasons up there. One season I kicked over 90%, which was a record at the time, and hard to do in Green Bay, obviously. But anyway, it went on, and then all of a sudden, when I get into, towards the end of my career, some of the announcer would say, future Hall of Famer. Didn't even know much about that. But anyway, after 5 years after I retired, and I had the most field goals in history of football. I had, several records, but I just got a telegram from Pete Elliott. He was executive director of the Hall of Fame, and said, "You are one of the 15 finalists for the Hall of Fame. Let us know where you're going to be before the press conference at noon." But it's the selectors, they meet the day before the Super Bowl. At that time, there was only 28 selectors, I believe, and 15 finalists. And that's how and then I got my hopes up a little bit, and I was actually down the Super Bowl was in Tampa Bay that year. And they had a silver anniversary celebration of the 25-year Super Bowl team. And I was elected to the kicker on the 25-year team. And the night before we had a banquet, I remember Jack Buck, who was then the voter from St. Louis. I rode up the elevator with him, and he says, "Young man, I want you to know that you get my vote tomorrow morning." And I thought, well, I'm getting 1 vote for sure.
And, you're not going to get shut out.
Then we went down to the parade. I know that a lot of people in that parade were also finalists, and I didn't hear anything. And then I called back to the hotel, and my son was with me, answered the phone. Actually, the operator said the line was busy and 6 calls waiting. So I asked him to break in, and my son informed me then that he was talking to somebody at USA Today, and that made the Hall of Fame. And
wow.
And cell phones were not that common in 1990 when I borrowed some. And I didn't tell anybody for a while, because there were a lot of other guys that the parade was just about to start. They were in that thing, so I didn't really want to spread the word. But then Forrest Gregg, who had traded me, he took over Green Bay. This is a long answer here, David.
That's okay.
Bart Starr had been fired in Green Bay, and you don't fire a Bart Starr.
No.
But anyway, and we had good teams up there. We went to the playoffs in 1982 season. But anyway, Forrest had traded me, and he got some criticism over that, but he had heard, so he came down running to me. He says, "You're in the Hall of Fame." And I thought, well, that's awfully nice of him, because I wasn't too happy with him here. He had traded me to Minnesota, which was good in some ways, because I got to kick indoor for a season, which was a lot easier. But anyway, so the word got out, of course. But it wasn't until really very end in my career that was even a possibility. But it happened very quickly, and I got in right away the first year.
That's awesome. Not a lot of people, obviously it's a very special group to be in there and to get in on your first opportunity. That's pretty cool. Now, as an architect, you're an engineer. So can you talk about the technical side of kicking a field goal?
No, I can Not really. I tell you what, when I start kicking field goals and I played soccer, you never see who can kick the ball the furthest when you play soccer. You don't play, you pass the ball and you use both feet, you use your head, you use your heel sometimes instead of the toe. So
Yeah.
I always ended up taking the penalty kick and the corner kick because I had a knack for kicking the ball far. And I didn't really know that when I started kicking even at Montana State. I knew that I always could kick the ball further than most of the kids, but I didn't pay much attention to that as I grew up. So then they told me to kick the ball high and far. So in soccer, you always kick the ball low because the goalpost is only about 7.5 feet high. So to kick high, you just got to lean more backwards and follow through higher or whatever. So I could, like a golf, you hit it low, you had follow through flatter, and if you hit it high, you stand behind the ball and follow through higher. So that was pretty easy. I basically told my body, you got to kick the ball higher, and that's all it took. And I knew what my body took over, and I knew what I could do. Now in golf, I become a lot more complicated. So they tell me to hit the ball high. I'm just like everybody else. I'd stand up a little bit differently. I'd turn my hands differently. So I made that very complicated. Although I became a pretty low handicapper for a while. But kicking, I had a talent for that. There's no question that I had a talent because I remember at the time they're going to find some guy in Hungary or in South America that's going to hit it a lot further. But they did that for many years. They tried almost everywhere around the country. You remember this before most of the Americans got involved, although some were involved then too. And it took me quite a few years before I realized, they're going to have a hard time. They may not find anybody hit the ball harder than I could. But then also I went through the whole evolution. We start practicing more as the field got better. We start get special teams coached in the late 70s. We start breaking in the punter as a holder. I didn't do that until I got to Green Bay in 1980. We got more reps. And then so I went through a lot of the evolution. And finally I also decided, why don't you kick every football the same? Why you don't get penalized for kicking the 30 yards through the goalpost? So if the turfs were good, I would kick everything when there was a 25-yard field goal or a 55, I would make the same move. And I would go around and tell the kicking camps around the country. And I would tell people as I learned, different things over my career. And a lot of those guys later became special teams coaches in the NFL and kicking consultants. If I had known that, I probably would have done that over the years because now they're paying pretty well for those things.
Yeah.
The engineering thing, although I took engineering in school, but I switched to actually the general business. I thought that'd be more helpful for them to move back to Norway. That was my plan all the way along. Later, when HNTB Corporation, it was called Howard Needles Hammond in those days, and actually that firm, it merged with Kivett Myers, who was also the architect for the airport in 1973 that opened, and the Truman Sports Complex in 72 and 73. HNTB was the architect for that. So although they hired me for business development, so my business card, it says Director of Marketing, Sports Facilities, HNTB Group. So I went to work. I knew about our project. I learned what our designers could do. So I went out, called, emailed, traveled a lot. And anytime we heard about a college team or a pro team looking at a renovation or new stadium, I was the guy that tried to get in the door and get a team up to bat. And once we could keep the interest going and the competition became down to a few people, of course, then the really talented designers took over. So I was a door opener for HNTV for about 22 years.
I do want to talk a little bit about the technical. I think you're being humble that you probably know more than you want to share about the technical side of kicking. But what I know about it is moving the contact point 1 inch on the football can make a huge difference in where it goes, how high, how far, and stuff.
Well, that's true. Now you got to keep in mind it happens so fast.
Yeah.
Now if you practice like when I practiced those days after warm-ups or stretching before every practice, the grass on the practice fields was long enough that I could easily rest the foot, just put it in the grass. It stands straight up, and I would kick it across the goalpost to Gerald Wilson, of a great punter. He will field it, punt it back over to me, and then we did that. And then we joined the practice, and then we kicked on Friday afternoon with the center and the holder. But no question. The sweet spot is a very small spot. If you top it a little bit, the ball is going to go a lot lower. If you hit it too low, it's going to spin faster. The kicks that go the furthest, I want pretty slow rotation. That's when you hit it right. But when you kick it several times, or 100 times, 1,000 times, in practice at least, when the ball sits perfectly, you hit that sweet spot almost every time. Now, you get in the game, and the snap is a little off, and the holder has to turn it a little bit, and those type of things, then it becomes, more difficult. And I had a great holder in Lenny Dawson, and I had good snapper, but still, we didn't. My percentage didn't improve much till I get a lot more practices, because they had special teams coaches. We got to kick at least 3 days a week with maybe a backup center, maybe not the guy in the game, but a backup center, and we broke in the punter as holders. So we got more practice. That's why my percentage go up to 80, and a couple of times about 90 degrees. I wasn't as talented as I was 15 years before, but we start practicing a lot more. And also now that you got a snapper. You got a snapper also. So, and you move back to 8 yards. There's less block kicks. So the evolution continues, and they are really good. When I started kicking 50-yard field goals, people thought that was a pretty big deal. Well, they gotten so good now that if you miss from 50 yards, it's a big deal.
Yeah.
And Butke, for example, he has a cannon over leg. He probably hits the ball as far as anybody I've ever seen. And he reminds me a little bit, he's such a great young man. He reminds me a little bit of his Bryson DeChambeau in golf.
Yes.
Taking the next, I think, I don't talk to, when I talk to Harrison, we don't talk about kicking at all. But I'd see that they have, people, certain dietitians, and they have certain workouts they do to get more of a hip speed, even on the kicking thing or whatever. So it's improving all the time. But it was a big, the 20 years or 19 years I was in the league, it was quite a bit in evolution doing that too. So I feel like I know quite a bit about it. But the interesting thing was, though, when I had a couple of young kids that wanted me to, I knew were pretty good. When I called the special teams coaches, even in the mid-90s, they thought, well, what do you know about it? And I thought, since I went through everything you can think of for 20-some years, I think I know quite a bit about it.
Yeah. Do you ever get tired of hearing people say, well, all he has to do is kick the football, kick field goals and extra?
Well,
how hard can that be?
I tell you one thing, I have to say this. To end up, the timing that I had to come to the United States, and got into this football thing, the timing was right. Then also when I got to the NFL or the AFL, only a couple of years before that, I expanded the squad from 33 to 38 to 40. A couple of years before I was 40. So now I started thinking maybe somebody only kicked, you have room for him on the team. So the timing was perfectly right from that point. I feel very fortunate that I ended up in a sport that all you could do to make a living was to kick a football. Because I remember my college teammate says, first of all, when I got the scholarship to kick, I thought, you get a scholarship for just kicking a football? They said, yes. Then they said, you can make it in the pros maybe. And I said, you get paid for doing that in the pros? And I said, yes. So what a great country, right? So that's how I felt about that early on. But it is not as easy as it looks. Like when you watch golf day on TV, you see the greatest golfers in the world.
Yeah.
But they hit a 7-iron with a smooth little swing, and it flies 195 yards, 2 feet from the pin. You think you can go out in the driving range and do something similar. So I can compare that to kicking a little bit.
Yeah.
It looks easy, but to be very good at it, you have to be, you have to have some coordination and have some talent and some athletic ability. There's no question about that. But there again, do you have to be like a Herschel Walker or or some of the greatest athletes in the world? I don't think so, but I think you have to be pretty athletic. And that's why I always encourage people when I want to start kicking early. I kicked the football for the first time when I was 23 years old.
Yeah.
That compete in all kinds of other sports, because you need coordination, used to competition, and you need some athletic ability to be really good at it.
Now, you and I talked before. I don't want to dwell on it, certainly, because you had such a great career. But what do you remember about the Christmas Day game in 1971?
Well, when you're a professional, you expect to do well all the time. So when I was sent in for game-winning kicks, and all of us fairly inexperienced at it, you always are expected to make it. I remember at Montana State, when I went and I kicked the field goal, even if I missed, I cheered because the ball went so far. Didn't see it before. Now you get into the pros, the expectations of it totally different. I mean, you got to make the kick. If not, they get somebody else. You're not good enough. You let down the team. So that thing that happened on Christmas Day 50 years ago, I remember that more than kicking 3 field goals in the Super Bowl, although the Super Bowl, but that's the only game I can say I was really nervous before the game. But we got off to a good start. We had, I got 3 field goals and got off to a good start. But in that Christmas Day game, it lingers a lot. Now, there were a couple of things that made it even worse. One of the kicks that I missed right before the half was supposed to be a trick play. It didn't work out, and also had one kick blocked in the overtime. So in my own mind, I still take it very personally hard, because if I could have kicked a 32-yard field goal right before the end of the game, we would have won the game. So it doesn't matter if it was a trick kick or a block kick. It doesn't matter. It came up to me with 30 seconds to go, and I fell from 32 yards. That's about the same distance as an extra point, a yard shorter than that. So that bothers me a lot, even to this day. And I have to admit, when the playoff starts and we play the Miami Dolphins again, or the Chiefs play them, or the playoff starts, it comes back to me, and it doesn't it stay with me all the time, but it comes back every year, and it bothers me. There's no question about that.
But you've moved past it. How did you come to grips with that? How did you move past it?
Well, you never do. The question is, you got to be able to, when you step on the field the next year or whatever, you have to be able to overcome it. Otherwise, you're not going to make it. So I guess even though I would think about it maybe on a Monday or Tuesday, I never thought about it before a game, or if it came into my mind, get it out of your mind. You have to concentrate. And if you can't, you're not going to be competitive anymore. So it wasn't easy. I was thinking about retiring after that. It was hard to take. But I thought I was good compared to what I saw in the league. Then I gotta do the best I can. So I was able to get 14 more years in the league and set a lot of records, and personally ended up in the Hall of Fame. So when you look at the resume, yes, that they will always be on the resume as a very huge negative. But still, personally, I was able to set enough records to be considered as a good kicker. But the only thing that I cannot change the game of that, can't change the score of the game. And so that's, but how do we overcome? It's part of you. You just hope that most of the things you do can overshadow that. And when you talk about that a little bit, I know that Lynn Elliott has been criticized a lot, of course, and they bring up over and over and over again. In those days, I lived in Colorado. On that particular playoff game, I lived in Colorado Springs for 16 years. I never saw that game on television. I was traveling somewhere that day. And I assume, I don't know though, I never met the man. I know he was a fine kicker. It was in January, and before that, heating elements at the stadium. I assume that the field was frozen. It was a cold day. The worst thing you can have for a kicker is if the footing on your plant foot is not good. There's not much you can do, but you're a professional. You're supposed to make it anyway. I remember even in Super Bowl IV, there were so many holes in the tarp, and if you see highlights from that game, there's a lot of mud on that field. And this is 50-some years ago. I had cleats that were 1.5 inches on my left heel, and they held up. But every time I was kicking those 3 kicks, at least 2 of them were out of a pretty muddy spot. I was concerned about my footing, but it did hold. But it's still, when you know that, it still guards you a little bit. So the swing isn't quite normal.
Yeah.
But if footing, because I remember kicking in Shea Stadium in New York one time in the pregame warm-up, I thought, oh boy, I hope I don't get too many attempts today. But you can't say that. That's something you can't share with anybody. I can't tell the coach about that. I can't tell the lineman that, God damn it, go out and kick the field goal. I don't care what the conditions are like.
And I grew up a Chiefs fan. I remember the team coming to Kansas City in 1963 from Dallas. I was 5 years old, but my dad was excited that we had pro football. So I was excited. And as I think back on some of my favorite Chiefs, you're certainly on that list. And I remember Christmas Day, 1971, but I also remember January 11th, 1970. And I remember many, many kicks that you had in your career. So I just from a personal standpoint, I want you to know that a lot of longtime Chiefs fans remember way more positives than that one negative. I want to ask you about, did the Chiefs treat you any differently? What did they do to support you moving forward?
I did not. I know that obviously the teammates were disappointed, and I was very disappointed. Nobody ever said something terrible to me at the time at all. They may have felt like it. They didn't. We ended up teammates for many years. We won still quite a few games. Hank Stram was my biggest fan. And there is something, I guess he felt like I could still, the chances of me helping win games and getting another kicker anywhere, he probably felt that I could do that better than anybody else.
Yeah.
But Hank was always a big supporter. God darn it, he almost felt me feel like I was, in spite of what happened. And we all have games. There are people drop passes, people miss blocks. I know that, and people throw interceptions. But that is not an excuse for me. It still bugs the hell out of me that I couldn't do better on that particular day. But Hank was my biggest fan, I think.
Yeah, and that's got to go a long way. Just the confidence, because Yogi Berra, the famous baseball player, had a quote. He had many quotes that are funny, but one of them is 90% of the game is half mental. and we all know what he's trying to say, that the mental aspect is important. And that's certainly true in kicking, is you've got to believe that this kick, no matter what happened the last one, this kick is going straight through the uprights.
That is the heart. I remember Hank gave me an example when he was holding the ball for me before my rookie year. He knew I could kick. He could see that, but he had no idea how I could compete or whatever. So he said, who Mickey Mantle is? Of course, coming from Norway years before I had heard of Mickey Mantle, obviously. He says, here's something I want to tell you. I've seen Mickey Mantle, Hank Stram says this, strike out twice in the game. Late in the game is up to bat, and somehow he makes a game-winning hit. What he was trying to tell me is, when you miss a kick, that cannot force you to miss the next one. Now, that's a lot easier said than done, because you miss a kick, you go back on the sideline, you're upset with yourself, your teammates are not too thrilled about you, the fans aren't too thrilled about you, there's still no warm-up nets, you just stand there and stretch a little bit, and an hour later you go in again. And the last thing you did was not do well.
Yeah.
So, but that goes, you get paid for doing this job, that goes to the territory. That is part of the job description. If you fail too often, you're not going to have a job. I don't know how many kickers was in the league during the years I played, several hundred, I'm sure. And I felt that, hey, if I go in and miss the next one here, not necessarily in that game, but in later, even or before too, if I go in and miss this one, I may not be on the team next Monday. And if that's the case, I also am off the payroll.
Yeah.
So that was the added pressure. But that's the way I have no sympathy. I mean, kickers don't get physically. And football is a tough game. You see some of what they go through. Those guys are phenomenal athletes, and they're tough, and they're strong, and they're big, and they're tough. I mean, they are great athletes and tough men.
I want to ask you about one of your other athletic pursuits. I understand you were a really, really good golfer for a long time. Do you still play? And just talk about your love of golf.
Well, I joined Melbourne Country Club in 1969, the year we won the Super Bowl, because my first house was close by there, and I hardly played. First time I saw golf, I thought they come over, close to my house. Some overweight big people were riding in a cart. Then they roll out, they hit the ball 20 yards on the ground in the rough, get a drink, go back in the cart, take a drink, roll the cart about 20 yards, do the same thing again. I said, this is a sport. I didn't respect it enough. So then I joined the club because one of the presidents of the country club banker worked in the off season. He was a member there. And I started pretty slow. The first 10 years, I didn't know where the driving range was. But about by 1980, I started realizing, hey, this is difficult or whatever. So I practiced a lot. And that practice, so I got down to a 2 or 3 handicap for a long, long time. And I did win the club championship one year. And I played on that celebrity tour. We started out in Lake Tahoe. I played there for about 10 years. And was actually in the running a couple of times in the early 2 rounds and shot, par several times in the competition. But yeah, so I was a decent country club player. But compared to the really good players, no. But compared to most country clubbers, I got pretty good. And I had 6 holes in one, so I got to say that. And I'm still hanging on to a single-digit handicap at barely. So that's so-so.
And so you shoot your age with regularity still.
I've done it a few times now. Millburn, we played the par 72, and last year it was the first time in 4 years I hadn't done it. But I went to a couple of other clubs, the par 70, and a couple of other clubs around the area here. They're also very good golf clubs. So I did shoot my age a couple of times. I think I can do that for a little while longer, I hope.
I was playing at a course up in Kansas City, Kansas last summer, and I was with a group of older gentlemen. I was doing a course review for a local magazine, and the number 10 green borders, or behind that is the number 14 green, I think. And the guy I was in the cart with, he hollers at this other guy. He said, how are you doing? He said, I'm 2 over. And I thought, this is an older gentleman. I said to my friend, 2 over what? And he said, oh, he's 2 over par. He's 93 years old, and he shoots in the upper 80s most of the time. He shoots his age practically every time out. And I said, my goal is to shoot his age. At 62, I want to shoot 93.
That's one great thing about the game. I get some exercise. I just so glad I took up golf. I underestimated the game totally. And then when I got to be asked to play as a so-called celebrity, not only in Kansas City, and I use that word pretty loosely or whatever, and around the country, and they fly you, and sometimes they even pay you to come in and play golf. I said, how lucky can I be? And you meet. And I played, for example, Pebble Beach every year now for 17 years, I think, and some of the greatest places around the country, even in the world. And then enjoy 4 or 5 hours with good friends, compete, play great places. It is a great, great game, and also a real challenge. So I know what I would do in my spare time if I didn't. And so now I love golf, although it upsets me that I'm not quite as good as you once were. But maybe tomorrow, who knows?
Yeah, there you go. I always like to give people an opportunity to talk about family, just talk about your wife, kids, grandkids, anything like that.
Well, my daughter lives in Kansas City. My son lives in Bozeman. My daughter works for Stenerud. My son struggles a little bit with different kind of work up in Bozeman. And I have a granddaughter that lives here in Kansas City.
All righty. Last thing I'd like you to do for me as a longtime, this is a national podcast, but obviously I'm based in Kansas City. So I would like you to say, go Chiefs in Norwegian.
Well, it's hard to translate the Chiefs. Let me see. Heia sjefene.
I couldn't have said it better myself, my friend. Thank you very much for joining us. This has been a pleasure.
David, I enjoyed meeting you, enjoyed the conversation, and I enjoyed the fans very much in Kansas City, and of course all the great Packer fans. And also I had a very nice time up with all my Scandinavian friends in Minneapolis as well.
Thanks for listening to Sports Connections with David Smale. Make sure to subscribe, follow, and rate the show from your favorite podcast platform. You can learn more about David Smale and his work by visiting davidsmalebooks.com. Don't forget to join us weekly for new episodes. Until next time.